take a moment or two to fill our cup, to do something kind for ourselves first. For a long time, I was plagued with guilt that came with any measure of self-care that I proceeded to administer. Why the guilt? Well, as I examined things more closely, I found that the guilt is there because we have somehow been taught to believe that putting ourselves first is rude and ill-mannered. And because many of us have been taught to believe that activists are supposed to be self-sacrificing, suffering, selfless. And if we finally get over this guilt, we realize that enacting any measure of self-care is actually hard. And why is it so hard? Because real self-care actually requires self-discipline and is not necessarily the quick fix that we have been conditioned to getting, or that the industrial wellness complex has been trying to sell us on. In my work, I invite people to be compassionate with themselves, and I invite them into the practice of caring for themselves. These two elements do not necessarily require a lot of resources. Self-care doesn't need to be overbearing. It's about developing a willingness to choose to take moments for ourselves, whether alone or in community. It is about learning to pause to connect with our heartbeat, and about being open to considering our own needs. It means pausing midday to go outdoors, allowing ourselves 15 minutes away from our desk, our children, our computers and phones. And once we figure out how to do this for ourselves, we need to then model that to others in our homes, our places of work, in our community, and out in the world. In doing so, we can begin to push against a culture that tends very much to keep us busy. But in doing personal work around this and then modeling it to others, I believe that we are practicing resistance to that do-it-all culture that we live in. Today, together, we are going to explore the concept that the pursuit of self-care is, in fact, a political act, and we will put into practice the idea that any type of movement, any single volunteer, or an aggregate community that is engaged in activism, in change, needs to sustain themselves by providing, sustaining, and creating an intersectional, integral, holistic movement. And in order to do that, we need to first acknowledge that while in many ways the self-care movement today has turned into a marketing tactic to sell expensive and unnecessary beauty products, the original premise of self-care preaches ideas that are well-intentioned and influential. It is only recently that self-care has become the new chicken soup for the progressive soul. To learn about how to create self-care movements within our communities of care, we need to first look to the past. Where did the concept of self-care initially even come from? Well, self-care originally caught on as a medical concept. Doctors have long discussed it as a way for patients to treat themselves and exercise healthy habits, most often under the guidance of a health professional. Prior to the late 1960s and early 1970s, these patients were usually mentally ill and elderly people who required long-term care and otherwise had little autonomy. Later, academics began to look for ways for workers in more high-risk and emotionally daunting professions, trauma therapists, social workers, EMTs, and so on, to combat stress brought on by the job. The belief driving this work was that one cannot adequately take on the problems of others without taking care of oneself, a sentiment you still hear from activists today. And that applied not just to physical welfare, but to mental and emotional health.